Story 1. Some memories don't weaken with time. They idle. They sit right outside the window of your mind and burn a low, steady fuel, and you start to think you can smell it even in fresh air. My name is Caleb R. Caleb's fine, and I'm a diesel mechanic. 38 then, recently divorced, and working long days outside Clovis, New Mexico. In late November of 2019, I was living in a single wide on a leased dirt pad off a farm frontage road near US 60, 3 miles past an unlit junction with County Road 13. If you've ever lived in a trailer through a panhandle wind, you know how thin the world gets. I liked it at first, cheap, quiet, predictable. My nights had a rhythm. Space heater humming, small AM radio tuned to talk no one listens to after midnight, a cup of black coffee cooling so slow it felt like it was thinking about it. I told myself the thing I loved most was the sound of distant trains, but truth is, it was the red safety lights on the co-op's grain silos. They blinked in a measured pulse. Order. It's an easy thing to fall in love with when the rest of your life's thrown into a shoebox. The first odd thing was small enough to feel silly. My radio caught a sound like a low idle, a truck idling somewhere close, maybe just behind the aluminum wall. I turned the volume down expecting it to go away, but it was like the radio was breathing. The idle deepened when I put the dial dead center on my usual station. The moment I nudged the knob, the idle slid away as if it didn't want to see me seeing it. I stepped out into cold air, breath puffing, expecting exhaust, tire tracks, someone using my pad to turn around. The lot was empty, no plume, no rumble, no lights. When I closed the door, the heater popped once and the radio drifted a hair off frequency by itself, like something bumped it with a fingertip. The next dawn, I found tire impressions in the caliche leading up toward my lot. Not deep, just the kind you get from a cautious driver easing in at night. The strange part was subtle. Only arrival tracks. Nothing showed a turnaround or exit. I told myself wind had rubbed out the rest, but there hadn't been wind. Still air has a sound in New Mexico, and I'd heard it all night. On the third night, the tapping started. At 2:14 a.m., 3 gentle raps on the aluminum siding by the kitchen window. Not hard enough to dent, not soft enough to be thermal expansion. I lay with my hand on the wall and felt a faint vibration like engine resonance. Your hands remember things your head argues with. I sat there with my palm flat and counted. 3 taps, minute of nothing, 3 taps. When I checked outside, the cold bit my lungs and my breath came out like I was already running. I shone a flashlight along the siding. Nothing, no scuff, no damage, no prank kid darting away across flatness that has nowhere to hide. By the 4th night, something in my chest was tuned to it. I'd feel the minutes before 2:14 like a weather front. I tried music, then the heater louder, then turning everything off to make the silence guilty of something. The red safety lights from the co-op lined up in my rear window the way they always had. Then a 5th red light appeared. Eye height, dead center, where no tower stood. It held, soft, no flare, and blinked once. When I moved to the window, it went black, and the remaining 4 looked embarrassed to still be there. I told myself to get sleep, do my job, stop watching the clock. It's a bad idea to fight time with coffee. The next day I found a page from a trucker's log tucked under my wiper blade. Blank grid lines, time column circled at 2:14, with a ballpoint that dug into the paper hard enough to leave pressure marks on the page beneath. No name, no plate, just a faint diesel smell that wasn't my truck's. There's a smell of warm diesel that lives in the metal, like a memory between molecules. This was that, but seasoned with distance, like something you'd pick up on an old jacket from a cab you used to drive. I started noticing my own boot prints in the dirt did not quite match the distance my legs should have made. Same tread, size 12 with the missing corner on the left heel. Mine. but spaced wrong by inches in a pattern that made me think of falling asleep at a red light and waking up already moving. I don't drink. I do get tired. The thermostat read 72 most nights. The night the bathroom mirror fogged, the heater was set to 72 too, yet I could see my breath when I stood at the sink. The LED display on the thermostat, instead of showing degrees, glowed 214, no degrees Fahrenheit, just numbers. I tapped the plastic, and it snapped back. The vent coughed out air that smelled like the shop, like a just-killed engine. I know what vibration tells you. A real idol lives in your bones if you've spent enough hours under hoods. That late night, the whole trailer picked up a steady, low RPM resonance. The blinds quivered. The coffee in my mug put up a tiny, perfect ring. I looked past the kitchen window and saw my work truck out there at a slight angle, just a hair off how I parked it, like a stranger had returned it respectfully, but didn't know the small angle you love. I opened the door, expecting the cold to strip the dream off me. Yard empty. No truck. My own breath sounded too loud. When I went back inside, the vinyl chair at my little Formica table showed an oval in the seat cushion like a recent weight had risen. I put my palm on it. Warm. People say you're lucky to live alone because you know exactly what every sound is. Alone is exactly when you learn the opposite. An empty place makes sounds that belong to no one until someone says they do. I made myself sit down. I told the room out loud, "You can cut it out." The AM tuner slid on its own, just a whisper off center. The idol followed it. The last week before I moved, I slept in my clothes. At 2:14 the tapping came, and then didn't. The silence that replaced it was different, pressed like a hand on your sternum. I went to the bathroom to splash water and paused because the mirror was fogged in a clean rectangle. No shower running, no kettle, no humidifier. 3 finger-wide clean lines cut through the fog at the height and spacing of a steering wheel grip. One at 10 o'clock, one at 2, one lower, where someone rests a hand when they think. I stood there long enough that the mirror dried and I could see the soft red rectangle of the rear window behind me where the co-op lights should be. They were there. 4. No 5th. I left that trailer 2 days later. I told the owner the heater was finicky and the radio reception was bad. He shrugged like people do when the rent's cheap. I started taking the long way to avoid mile marker 214 entirely, even when it made me late. Still, there are nights on roads with different numbers when my dashboard clock sticks at 2:14 for exactly 1 minute and the vents start to breathe out that faint hot diesel. That's when I roll the window down and listen hard to the dark for an engine that's not there. Most of the time there's nothing. Some of the time, the nothing idles. Since then, I've learned something nobody told me in the shop. Some engines don't die when you turn them off. They just decide to wait for you somewhere quiet. I moved, but I didn't move them. I don't look at the mirrors for too long when the highway's empty. If I catch that 5th red blink in there, even for a second, I keep both hands at 10 and 2 and don't check the time. I don't think the sound wants me to know what hour it is. I think it wants me to forget, but I remember anyway, because remembering is the only way I can keep it from sliding the dial for me. I don't live there anymore. The idol didn't care. Story 2. There are things I wasn't ready to talk about when they were happening, because if you name a pattern out loud in the wrong place, it turns into law. My name is Linda H., 54 at the time, night shift nurse in Mingo County, West Virginia. I'm widowed. Back then, my trailer sat 50 yards off Route 52 outside Gilbert, where fog learns the shape of your yard, the way a stray learns the sound of your cabinet doors. I kept life in a narrow groove. Home a little after 3, tea kettle on, 2 crackers standing on their edges like walls in a tiny white bread city, scrubs in the sink with lemon soap. I fed a small gray stray who showed up before the thaw and kept to the shadows like being seen might count against her. I called her Little Bit. I told myself I only named her so I could say I wasn't attached. If you've spent enough nights in ward corridors, you know how to hear a hinge from a floor away. My screen door started speaking to me in early spring of 2007. The kind of thaw where the fog sits low and the culvert at the edge of your lot runs like a breath under the ground. The hinges began a slow, even creak, as if the door opened halfway, paused, and eased shut. The latch chain tapped the frame in pairs. 2 clicks, beat, 2 clicks, like a metronome that didn't care about songs. The air was still. The trailer held its temperature like a prayer. Little Bit would eat out of my hand at 2:50 a.m., purr against my ankle, and then at midnight exactly, I could not get her to cross the threshold. She'd sit with her front paws on the line and stare at the empty rectangle of night and growl low, embarrassed to be afraid. The first time the pager beeps came in over my landline, I thought someone had sat on an old device in a drawer. That 90s chirp is baked into my spine. But the line was clear. The beeps were followed by the sound of my own answering machine greeting from years ago, the one I recorded before my husband died, when my voice had just enough softness left for people to hear it. "Hi, you've reached Linda and Ron. Leave a message." It looped twice and cut off in the middle of my name the second time. I stood with the receiver to my ear and felt the quiet press against the other side of a house I couldn't see. When I called the number back, my phone bounced dead air at me like a hallway with the lights off. A week later, I heard the intercom chime we use in the hospital's basement service corridor. That chime has a shape. If you know it, you can count the distance from the supply room to the break on a gurney without thinking. It rang in my kitchen. Floor wax and old antiseptic came up through the linoleum, as clear as if I'd spilled a bottle. I lifted my stethoscope without thinking and laid the diaphragm on the floor, because sometimes concrete tells the truth wood won't. The trailer carried a rhythm like a weak heartbeat, 4 beats and a long pause, then 4 again. When I stood, it stopped. When I sat absolutely still, it started up like someone was settling in to be heard. The door's mesh started showing faint smudges at chin height. Grease from forehead skin leaves ovals if you lean too long against a window to watch rain. I washed the screen inside and out. The next night, there were marks on both sides at the same height, as if 2 faces pressed there from opposite worlds at the same time. I held my own face there to measure. I measured out of habit. It matched. I started timing the culvert because nurses time things they can't fix. The water rose and fell in regular pulses, independent of weather. 48 seconds exactly between the low bubble and the soft, brimful sound. 48 seconds. 48 seconds. I wrote it on a post-it and stuck it by the kettle. It felt like a promise I hadn't made. I kept thinking about the refrigerator photo, the one of me and Ron at Tug Fork with that crooked smile he got when he didn't want to admit he was cold. That Polaroid slid a half-inch across the magnet surface at 3:05 a.m. exactly. I know because I had the habit of standing with my tea and watching the red digits change while I waited for my body to catch up to the house being safe. The first night I blamed a sloping door. The second I moved the magnet to the other corner. The third I moved it to the freezer, opposite side, and marked the edge with a pencil line. It slid again, only far enough to make me notice, exactly when the door chain tapped twice. When the call came from the hospital's main number, I picked up like a reflex and said, "I see you, Linda," even though I was in my socks. The voice on the other end had my tone, but none of my air. "I'm still down here," it said, and hung up. I called back. The operator said no one had dialed out. She asked if I was sleeping enough. I said, "Sure," because the other answer puts things in motion. You can't stop once paper gets involved. I didn't tell her the intercom chime had started ringing from the sink drain. I didn't tell her the floor smelled like elevator cables coming warm from friction. One night in particular had the kind of fog that makes your yard feel like a room with a ceiling. Headlights turned into pale coins on the gravel. I pulled up the way I always did, nose to the cinderblock step. The screen door stood open like it was listening. On the inside mat there was a damp footprint, about my size, exactly my tread, but pointed toward the door, like someone, like me, had stood inside ready to leave. I reached for the handle, and the door came back toward me. Not a slam, not a yank. A steady, patient resistance, the way we brace a patient who thinks they can stand up without their blood getting involved. If you've trained your hands on bodies that are trying to go somewhere their chemistry won't support yet, you know that touch. The door held for a heartbeat, then eased. The chain tapped twice like a metronome agreeing with itself. I reinforced the door and changed the locks because that's what living people do. I told myself the footprint was a trick of damp carpet and memory. I told myself Little Bit's refusal to cross the threshold after midnight was about mice or a shadow in a brain that evolved to stay alive in trees. But then came a night when the landline beeped, the intercom chimed, the culvert pulsed, and the entire trailer sat up and listened with me. And I knew in my chest what I didn't want to say out loud. The cadence wasn't coming from the house to me, I was coming home to it. The pattern existed whether or not I acknowledged it. I moved to a small apartment in town at the end of the month. I told the landlord my hours, asked about parking, fed the change machine like a normal person. The very first night, I woke at 3:05 a.m., like somebody had rung a bell inside my skull. Nothing moved in the room. The chain on the apartment door is different, newer metal, different sound. But I heard the old chain from the trailer, 2 taps spaced as always, no echo to belong to. I got up and stood in the hallway and put my hand on the cool painted wood, and for 5 long breaths, I let myself pretend it was only tinnitus, and then I stopped pretending because pretending is just fear with better manners. When I turned on the kitchen light, Little Bit sat on the counter. She hadn't been there when I moved in. I hadn't seen her since the night I left the trailer standing open to fetch the last box. She was dry, clean, calm. She stared at the apartment door the way she used to stare at the screen, ears forward, low growl like a motor that had learned to idle without moving. I said her name. She didn't blink. She looked at the door until the minute turned and the feeling let go. I still drink my tea at strange hours. I still stand with my hand on the door some nights and think about the quiet that presses back. At the hospital, when the basement intercom chimes, I have to breathe through the urge to count 48 seconds and wait for something to rise. I tell myself doors close, but I learned something in that trailer I can't unlearn. Some thresholds don't belong to the walls they're attached to. They learn people the way a bed learns a body's shape. You can change addresses. A hinge can remember. That door learned to wait, and I live with the waiting more than I live with the lock. Story 3. If I hadn't worked around high voltage, I'd say I imagined it. The thing about electricity is you learn how it talks when it doesn't have a mouth, how it swells in the air before it arcs, how it lives in your hair before you've even touched the line. My name is Miguel A., and in August of 2015, I was 29, an apprentice lineman living cheap in a travel trailer I'd hauled onto a gravel turnout off Arizona State Route 64, 10 miles south of Valle. There's a cut there where the transmission corridor runs behind a disused service road, the towers standing farther apart than seems comfortable, like tall guys not wanting to crowd each other in an elevator. Monsoon season was acting strange that year. Afternoons piled up with sky, and evenings cleared in a way that felt like the desert rolling its shoulders. My normal was simple. Schematics spread on a folding table, a handheld VHF for storm reports, boots lined up under the tiny bed. I'd walk the service road by headlamp at night to check the towers, not for work. Contract said don't. But because I needed my feet to tell me where I was. If you're comfortable around electricity, you stop checking every shadow. You trust your skin. The first night I felt it. The air leaned into my arms like static, but there were no clouds. My headset picked up a whispering carrier with no voice. You know that empty sound that feels like someone holding a conversation in another room? That, but tighter, right inside the foam over my ears. When I stepped to a certain 5-foot patch near the bumper of my trailer, the headset clicked like a cheap Geiger counter. Not fast, not frantic, an insistent, regular tick that only went away when I stepped out of the patch. I chalked it up to a bad ground, checked the hookups, moved the trailer 3 feet. The patch stayed where it was. It did not move with me. On my second night, just after midnight, a sound rolled out over the flat like the memory of a highway. A soft boop, the hollow tone of an old roadside emergency call box. The kind I hadn't seen on this stretch in years. It came from where the service road curved, then again, farther away, mapping a shallow arc that suggested a presence moving without having to show itself. I took my headlamp and swept it along the scrub and gravel, and the beam bent. Not much, not enough to call it wrong to someone else. But across one specific angle toward the nearest tower, the cone softened and smeared like heat shimmer. Except the night air felt cold enough on my teeth to taste the metal. I started testing the patch because that's what I'm good at. I dragged a length of chain through it on the third night, slow. Blue flecks of light jumped off the links in the dark, and the chain gave off a rhythm that continued for 1 extra second after I stopped moving it, like the metal had decided to keep time. I marked the gravel with cheap survey flags, a little red line to say, "Here, here, and here." I went to bed and woke to find the flags in the same pattern, but mirrored, as if the site had flipped along an axis while I slept. My trailer hadn't moved. The world had, a little. The sign came next, or didn't. 40 yards down the service road, the reflective triangle appeared in my headlamp. Caution next 1/4 mile. In daylight there was no signpost, no bolt holes, no footings. At night the triangle shone back at me as cleanly as a truth. The dust on my boots showed I walked exactly to where it should be each night, and then veered, always to the right, with the same precise hesitation you get when your brain knows something you won't admit in words. Time started misbehaving the way it does when you work doubles. My wristwatch lost 6 minutes between 12:17 and 12:23 a.m., then ran fine the rest of the night. The VHF clock compensated in the opposite direction, gaining 6 minutes in that same span as if time had been borrowed from one device and deposited in another by a careful clerk. I replaced batteries. Same. Swapped watches with a buddy when he visited. His lost time with mine and laughed when I told him. It's hard to make a clock sound like a threat to someone who hasn't heard metal sing. Then came the thunderhead that wouldn't move. On a clean sky evening, one bruise-colored pillar stood beyond the service road, not on the horizon where weather belongs, but at a depth your eyes don't have vocabulary for. No lightning, no rain, no slow slide across the landscape. It just was, like a photograph somebody taped to the world. I kept walking my route. Every night it remained where it did not belong, and every afternoon the sky forgot it had existed. When I dragged the chain through the patch again, the spark skittered and stopped, then ghosted on, this time faintly, along a path I wasn't making. I stood quiet and heard the chain clink once, late, the way a footstep sometimes sounds after the person is already gone. The emergency call tone booped from the far left, and then nearer still, not centered but offset, like it respected a boundary I hadn't named. There's a point at which chasing a thing becomes letting it in. I told myself I was doing field work. I laid flags, made notes, tested with different metals, even set the VHF on scan and let it roll. My watch lost time at 12:17. The VHF gained at 12:17. The call box tone arrived 3 times, far, medium, near, and then stopped at the invisible triangle. The reflective surface of the sign brightened, as if it were catching a beam from a car that wasn't coming from either direction. The headlamp shimmer didn't change with batteries. None of that counts as a story until you hear it inside your body. The night the desert made its ocean sound, low, rolling shh, like surf far away, my trailer windows fogged from the outside. It was warm, and yet the glass wore dew like a warning. I stepped out into air that felt thick, as if the particles had linked arms. The triangle winked ahead, bright and clean. The call tone booped once more, and then nothing. Long nothing. The kind that finds your heart rate and adjusts to match. When I lifted my boot into the patch, the ground accepted the weight twice as deep for 3 paces. My boot sank, then released with a soft, unsticking sound that made a part of my brain want to apologize to a place for disturbing it. On the 3rd step, I looked back. There were 3 prints spaced wrong by inches. The first and the last oddly deep, the middle invisible, as if I'd crossed a short distance by skipping a beat in a song only I could hear. I waved my light over them. The beam bent again. Heat shimmer where there was no heat. A smear over the absent print, as if the air preferred that there be no record of the distance traveled. I took one careful step forward and felt my ribs tighten like a belt. The sign flared one shade brighter without changing color. Caution. Not an instruction you decide to ignore when the night is speaking in a language your training respects. I stepped back. The world loosened. The surf sound diminished. The fog on the glass receded in a pattern that made me think of breath, not weather. I placed fresh flags to map the missing print. In the morning, the flags wore a mirror of what I'd done. No tracks, but mine in the dust. No chain marks, no sign support. The thunderhead that never moved wasn't there, because in daytime nothing acknowledged that night had an extra layer glued to it. I filed an incident report about unusual field charge. The supervisor smiled the way people do when you try to give them a problem that won't fit on a form. He wrote something down anyway. "We don't get hazard pay for time behaving strangely," he said. He didn't say I was tired, but let the words sit on the table between us. I kept the mirror image flags in a coffee can with nuts and washers and a pencil that left silver on your skin. Years later, different line, different assignment, a substation went out. Right before it did, the truck radio spit a quick, hollow boop, call box tone, unmistakable, and the rear view mirror showed a triangle brightening for a fraction of a second where the highway opened into nothing. I slowed without deciding to, the way you do when the world has told you to measure your steps. The outage report blamed equipment. The repair made sense on paper. My watch kept time and the VHF didn't argue, but when I turned my headlamp on in the yard that night just to take the trash out, the beam smeared one thin degree into the darkness, and I felt the patch under my feet even on concrete. If you work around power long enough, you stop believing in coincidence and start respecting cadence. I don't go looking for the sign anymore. It arrives when it wants to be seen and reflects a light no one brought. People think warnings are for drivers. Maybe they are, most days. But I've come to think the one out there, the one that appears 40 yards down an unkept road and speaks in old tones, was never meant for cars. Some nights when the air leans into my arms and the chain clinks a beat late in memory, I think it was meant for me. Story 4. Some systems hold you together when grief wants to scatter you. The mail, for me, was that system. I retired early from the library the year before, 63 in the winter of 1999, newly widowed and temporarily convinced that if I sorted the world into envelopes and postcards, it would behave. I'm Doris L., and my single wide sat on cinder blocks off Main Route 182, the Blackwoods Road, outside Franklin. Behind my lot, there's a salt marsh and a weathered wooden footbridge that crosses a narrow cut of water locals can take at low tide. I kept wind chimes by the door that never seemed to move, and a shoebox of correspondence that went back decades. I made a project out of it. A postcard a week to my sister in Bangor. One day set aside to read old letters in chronological order so that the dead could speak in neat lines and I wouldn't have to argue with the way memory jumbles. The postcards began appearing at 3:17 a.m. on my inside kitchen table. Old linen finish tourist cards I recognized from the 1970s, featuring places along Route 182 that hadn't seen business in years. A diner long closed, a bait shop with a phone number too short. Each card was addressed not to me, but to EL, with my current lot number. They bore current postmarks, ink bright as if the pad had just been pressed, but no stamps, no cancellation lines. Nothing to say they'd ever traveled except the fact that they arrived nowhere and exactly on time. The first night it happened, I thought I'd left something out and was now catching myself in the act of forgetting. I stack things, a habit from years of reshelving. The second night, with the card lying square on the table at 3:17, I opened the door to see if a human hand had dropped it through the screen. The wind chimes rang once, clean and solitary, though the metal tubes barely moved. It was exactly 3:17. I know because the digital clock on the microwave flipped, and I have lived long enough to respect numbers that show up more than habit allows. The writing on the cards unsettled me in a way fancy language doesn't. The fronts were the usual cheerful lies, a pier no longer safe, a sunset someone remembered incorrectly. On the backs, in neat block printing I didn't recognize, the notes described weather that matched the weather outside in the present tense. Fog over the flats tonight. Bridge boards swollen and loud. Gull prints along the ditch not flying, won't fly. I would read and then look up, half hoping the prediction would fail at once. It didn't. The wind chimes would ring once. The marsh would exhale. The footbridge would groan just once, a long board settling into itself, regardless of wind or tide. On the fourth or fifth card, a different hand appeared, and that fractured something I thought was still solid. My husband had written his whole life in a loose, left-leaning cursive. I could pick it out of a pile from across a room. On the back of a card, nothing else on it, sat a line in careful block letters that looked like he'd practiced each stroke to keep himself from betraying he was the one writing. Cross at low tide, wait for the silence. I knew that steadying of himself. He'd done it when our son was small and sick, and he had to be two people at once. He had never written in block letters in life. I lay flour around the kitchen table before bed because habits are experiments waiting to be named. In the morning there were no footprints, no smudges, no drag marks. The card sat clean on top of the flour, edges sharp as if it had settled from the air. The wind chimes did not move. The clock read 3:18. I swept the flour into the trash and left the lid open, irrationally hopeful that if something plated itself in my home, it would at least be polite and bus its dishes. I took a walk out back at low tide, the way the card had told me to. The marsh was flat and slick, a living map of small streams snaking into each other. The footbridge's boards were dark, and in the center were two indentations spaced like knees pressed to wood, deep enough to hold a little water. I knelt and touched them and felt cold that reminded my body of hospital rooms, not weather. From the far side, the marsh gave a small sound, not a splash, not a bird. A silence can make a shape if you listen wrong. I stood, unwilling to cross, and told myself I didn't have waterproof boots. I had exactly 3 pairs by the back door. Days collected into weeks. The cards kept to their hour. I sorted them by subject, by weather, by how much they asked of me without saying they were asking. A postcard appeared with a photo of a trailer I recognized too well. Mine, but not mine. It showed the lot in the early 80s, before the paint faded, when someone else owned it. In the small print on the back, almost like an afterthought, there was a typed line. Mailed 3:17 a.m., February 12, 1983. I moved into the trailer on February 12, 1996. You don't forget dates that carry both relief and defeat. On a heavy fog night in March, I woke at 3:16 and went straight to the kitchen table because pretending I wasn't going to do that made no sense anymore. I set out the shoebox, lined the previous cards like a little fence, and waited. At 3:17, the wind chime sounded once, clear as a thought. The card appeared without movement. There was no flicker, no hover, no trick my eyes could narrate to make me feel sane. It was simply there, and the laminate beneath it wore a dark ring of marsh water as if a glass had sweated. The card's back was blank. The front showed the footbridge from a little lower than my eye leaves me, as if someone shorter or kneeling had taken it. In the quiet after the chime, I heard a second set of breathing next to mine. I matched it, counted with it, then held my breath on purpose the way you do when you're checking if the house has settled. The other breath continued 2 more cycles, not louder, not weaker, and stopped. The next day, in daylight, I walked to the bridge and crossed it because I'm not good at being told what to do by my own fear. I stood in the center and looked back at the trailer. From that angle, the kitchen window caught the marsh light and gave it back in a milky square. I put my knees down into those indentations that weren't mine and felt the boards accept me like the lap of a chair that knew my weight from before. The silence was a sound, if that makes sense, like the absence of a fan you'd grown used to. I counted to 100, expecting nothing. At 99, something like heat or cold passed through me without changing my skin temperature. I stood, turned, and walked home very normally, because normal is a rope you can hold when a tide is stronger than you'd planned for. I told my sister, eventually. You know you're frightening someone you love when their first instinct is to talk about practicalities. She said I should stay with her. I said I wasn't leaving over postcards. I left 2 weeks later, not over postcards, not officially. The last week in the trailer, there were no cards at all. The chime did not ring. The marsh behaved like a marsh, and I pretended not to be offended by being ignored. I packed the shoebox. On my first night at my sister's apartment, I slept on her couch because it felt childish and safe. At 3:17 a.m., a single card slid from between 2 library books on her shelf and fell to the carpet with a soft, agreeable sound. We hadn't unpacked my books there. It was a photo of the footbridge in a fog thicker than the thickest I'd ever seen. The kind of fog that arrives out of season to remind you that seasons are human words. The caption read, "Wish you were here." No address, no postmark. When I picked it up, it was dry, but the palms of my hands felt damp until I washed them. In the corner, in small print, was the same lazy typeface as the mailed 3:17 a.m., February 12, 1983. No date this time. The wind chime in a packing box by the door, metal tucked between tissue paper, rang once from inside the cardboard. We looked at each other and didn't speak because there are moments when talking is the same as leaving a door open. I keep the box of cards in a closet my sister told me not to use, so the vacuum has a home. I haven't opened it in months. That's my way of believing I have a choice. Sometimes at 3:17 I'm awake anyway, because age has its recurring appointments. The apartment settles, the refrigerator cycles. I can almost hear the marsh give a long, old exhale 3 towns away. I don't open the door at that hour. I don't stand at the window to be seen by a silence that is too used to me. I did not keep the chimes. They made themselves heard. I used to sort the mail by sender. Now I sort by hour, and some nights I think the address on those cards isn't a place at all. It's a time, and I have to decide every single night whether to answer when it knocks without knocking,